Hello and welcome to the Legal Eagle. We welcome on the show a man with impeccable integrity. He became a senior advocate at the age of 38 and he's widely known as one of the nicest lawyers in the Supreme Court. I welcome on the show Mr. C.A. Sundaram, senior advocate of the Supreme Court. Mr. Sundaram, even as I welcome you on the show, I was reading on you and I remember how you spoke about your grandfather who at the age of 9 had asked you whether you want to become a lawyer and what you wanted to become, and you had said, yes, I want to become a lawyer. You've gone on to be one of the most famous lawyers in the country. You're also someone who always speaks up for people's issues. You've taken on the very famous 1989 S. Rangarajan case where there's a huge landmark judgment on the freedom of speech. You also appeared for Mr. Sushant Singh and helped him win that case. Today, sir, in the background of what's happening in states like Maharashtra, where freedom of press is being trampled in parts, where innocent journalists are being jailed, where a lot of times we are seeing media gag PILs being filed, how do you think this freedom of press can be protected?
Rhythm, freedom of press has a very unique place. The reason is that freedom of speech and expression, protected by Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution, itself is a most vital part of the Constitution, since without freedom of speech, you cannot have a democracy. It is the very basis of fundamental to a democracy is freedom of speech. Therefore, freedom of speech is an exceedingly valuable right. The Constitution itself, of course, puts down certain restrictions, but those restrictions are meant to come in when a freedom of speech can create problems which are far more than what freedom of speech actually defends. So our Constitution makers have very carefully thought it out and has given freedom of speech a primordial place in the Indian scenario, while at the same time placing some restrictions. Now, the reason I'm giving this little backdrop on freedom of speech is that if freedom of speech itself is vital to a democracy and is the fulcrum of a democracy, then freedom of the press is even more so, because without a free press, there is no democracy. The moment a press becomes answerable to the state or becomes nothing but a voice of the state or becomes nothing but a loudspeaker of the state, then that is the end of democracy. Therefore, freedom of the press is absolutely vital to democracy and has to be jealously protected. Of course, there is a lot of feeling now that even the press cannot exceed its freedom in a way that tramples on other people's fundamental rights, in particular fundamental rights under Article 21, like the rights of privacy, rights of fair trial, everything else. But overall, we've got to know that within the bounds of what is stated in the Constitution, within reasonable bounds where there can be some reasonable restrictions, the freedom of the press is quite absolute except for those restrictions. And that has to be, because without freedom of press, you cannot have a democracy at all. And without a democracy, that goes to the very basic structure of the Indian Constitution, and India as we know it will cease to exist.
Very true. And Mr. Sundaram, I heard you speak at one of the recent speeches that you'd given when you, as always being a citizen's lawyer, had also spoken about corruption, the Lal Batti culture, the VIP culture. In fact, you come from Chennai, where I know that you were, when it came to be designating you as a senior advocate, this was not done by a formal application as happens nowadays. It was done only when the senior-most lawyer there had suggested your name. Contrasting this with today's culture, when VIPs get away with things, when the political party in power in a particular state tries to usurp their power and tries to ensure that other people act under them and according to them, how do you think media needs to be here doing its work? Because it's suddenly called media trial. A lot of cases, of course the recent Sushant Singh Rajput case is an example. In this also a lot of criticism comes sometimes on how the media has actually reopened both the cases. So how do you feel this needs to be balanced? Because media trials, you had once said, is happening only because of the corruption in society.
Well, the fact of the matter is the media does walk a tightrope. we have to accept that the media does walk a tightrope. What is essential, absolutely essential, is that there cannot be any pre-censorship into the media reporting. While freedom of speech, for example, a cinematographic film, you can have pre-censorship. You cannot have pre-censorship as to news reporting, whether it's on electronic or it's in newspapers, because again, that's counterproductive to democracy. Again, you cannot have regulation of the media through the state, because the moment you have regulation of the media through the state, it again goes counter to the very basis of a free press and a free media. Therefore, the media itself has to take on the responsibility to ensure that it does walk that tightrope very carefully. Because the day the media falls and fails, then even if one particular aspect, one particular newspaper, one particular TV channel, if they fail, then everyone will get tarred by it and people will stop having faith in the media being able to regulate itself. So therefore, I must say time and again that the media has a huge responsibility, and that huge responsibility also carries with it great power. We cannot get carried away by that power and forget the responsibility. And that is why I have always believed that the media is so important, why it's called the fourth estate. And why it is so important is, when three pillars of democracy fail in that the people lose their absolute faith in them, where else will the people look but at the fourth pillar, the fourth estate? If people lose faith in the executive, they lose faith in the police, they lose faith in the police investigation, they lose faith in the judicial process, they lose faith because of the delays, they lose faith because of stories of corruption, they lose faith in the legislature because the legislature's action in many ways. When people lose that faith, people will turn to the media, and the media does become a people's court. The media thereafter does speak the voice of the people, and the people believe that their only succor, their only person they can look to is the media, because the other three pillars seem to have lost their confidence. Now, we have to accept, much as we'd hate to accept it, that people have to a great degree lost, or if not lost, their confidence has greatly been eroded over the last several decades over the other three pillars of democracy. And if that is so, it is but natural that they will put more faith than ever in the media, and the media more than ever becomes the voice of the people, more than ever becomes the people's court, and more than ever gets the power of being supported as a representative of the people. And with that power comes greater responsibility. The media has to be doubly careful. In fact, in the Madrid Convention in 1994, it was decided that free media should never be stopped. To report on a trial should not be prevented. However, while the media had every latitude on going into any kind of a trial or any investigation, they should never take away from one aspect. They should never pronounce anybody guilty or affect their being able to establish their innocence. Now, that's an easy thing said, because media will always have a slant. But all I'm saying is that slant can be used in two ways. One, a media can feel that they need to come out so strongly because the police are not acting, the official process is not acting properly, and bring to the eyes of the people what all are the fallacies in this, what all needs to be done, and be proactive. Now, that can be positive. But equally, the media, when crossing certain thresholds and trying to influence people in a certain way, that could become negative. So while I always maintain that free press is absolutely a sine qua non to our democracy and is absolutely essential, while there can be no pre-censorship of the press, while there can be no external governmental regulation of the press still has a responsibility and walks a tightrope. And that is something the press has to ensure. And we all pray that the press ensures it, because we have today put so much faith. The people of this country have put so much faith in the fourth pillar that I think it is vital that the fourth pillar also, on its side, the fourth pillar exercises its powers with great responsibility. Like I always maintain, the press should be the watchdog for the people. But the press should not be a guard dog for the blind, treating all the people as though they are blind.
Very eloquently said there, Mr. Sundaram. And I also want to ask you, when the Sushant Singh Rajput case had started, on this particular case, the Mumbai police's investigation was seen as completely shoddy. You've said in one aspect that it's when the police fails the people, they start looking at the media. How in this case do you feel the Maharashtra government or the Mumbai police's actions are to be seen? Because I remember right in the start you said just because he was hanging does not mean it's conclusive proof that Sushant Singh Rajput committed suicide.
Look, so far as that case is concerned, I don't think there is much doubt that in the very beginning, the alacrity with which the cause of death was decided, the alacrity with which they felt that there need not be investigation, the nature of the investigation, the manner of investigation, left everything to a lot of questioning. And like I said earlier, that when any agency does not exercise the powers it should in the manner it should, does not take the responsibilities it should, does not take the actions it should, they will lose the faith of the people. At that time, the media did come in and bring to the people the fact that there are a lot of anomalies, there are a lot of things to be done. At the time that when that happened and the media brought to the people there were a lot of anomalies, the people themselves then felt, yes, we think that the media press has not done its job, therefore we will listen to what the media is saying and then we will all make a public movement that something more should be done here. Well, that is what I call as proactive of the media, and that is a good thing. But after a given point, should we take very extreme steps and start saying that irrespective what it is, try to influence people in order to meet some own objective or other objective, then the press is also falling, the media is also falling into the same vice as the other pillars of democracy. So all I want to say is that the media can be tremendously proactive, as it has been in the beginning of the Sushant Singh Rajput case. There was tremendous proactiveness. That's not the only case. There are many other cases where the media has been tremendously proactive. The media, let us not forget, Rhythm, the media has the confidence of the people. Today, the people have confidence in the media, more confidence in the media than they have in the other three pillars of our democracy. They have more confidence in the media than anything else. And I am saying that the media should ensure that that confidence of the people is never let down. At the same time, we as citizens should also ensure that the media gets all the protection it deserves, because the media subserves one of the most important parts of our democracy, and it is vital to our democracy.
Absolutely. And Mr. Sundaram, I also want to ask you, 6 years after you were designated a senior advocate from Chennai, you had moved to Delhi. We've almost always spoken about Lutyens Delhi. But in the case like we earlier discussed, the Palghar FIR that was filed against Editor-in-Chief Arnab Goswami, at that time you'd also spoken out about how the Maharashtra government's actions had to be seen. Now they've moved to the Supreme Court. A Bombay High Court has given an interim order suspending all the FIRs filed by Congress states and also staying the operation of the Palghar and the Bandra incident FIRs that had been filed in Mumbai. This move of the Maharashtra government, how are you looking at these consistent moves that they have against media and trying to scuttle the voice of free media?
Well, Rhythm, I think you should take it for granted that the very balance of powers, the separation of powers, which they used to talk about when discussing the separation of powers between the executive and judiciary, and say that there are tussles between the executive and judiciary. My point is that if there is separation of powers will only succeed when there is a tussle between two pillars. If two pillars are both going the same way, then where is the separation of powers? If both are singing the same tune, where is the separation of powers? The separation of powers always sees that there's a bit of conflict between two powers, which is why each keeps the other in check. Now, so far as the media is concerned, inasmuch as a ruling government would like as little interference into what they're doing, and most governments tend to have a bias towards autocracy, anyone who comes to power has a bias towards autocracy. It is human nature. The media militates against it. The media finds fault. The media acts against them. The government on the other hand, therefore, would see the media as interfering with their absolute power, their right to act absolutely in the manner that they want to, and will see it. So there will always be a conflict between a government and a free media. A government will always want a media to sing the tune of the government, because the media doesn't. If the media sings the tune of the government knows the kind of political mileage they get. So they will always try everything in their power to get the media to sing their tune. And when a media does not sing their tune, they will do everything in their power to then put obstacles in the way of that media. And I think what you're facing is no different from the government of Maharashtra, since you've been quite vocal critics.
Mr. Sundaram, I also want to ask you, don't you believe the Maharashtra government has taken a step towards quite shocking behavior when they pass a privilege motion against our editor-in-chief? Because the privilege motion is always passed, you would be better aware of it since you're a constitutional expert, sir, when there are matters of utmost urgency. During the time of COVID, when there are farmers' issues they need to discuss and other issues in the legislative assembly that need to be discussed, a privilege motion is moved against Arnab Goswami. And what is even more shocking is they say it's being done because he was cruel to the chief minister. Is this laughable? Is this shocking? Or does this just leave one gasping and bewildered at the actions of a very lost Maharashtra government?
Rhythm, this is not the first time that the legislature has issued privilege motions. Very often the legislature, I think, does not understand the scope of privilege motions themselves legally as constitutionally in certain motions which they move. For example, in the case of Shobha Day, the legislature actually issued a privilege motion against her. She showed cause as to why. When she had said that why don't they serve vada pav in films, when there was a move that Marathi films should be made mandatorily available in the afternoons. Now, in that case, I think the legislature, she went to court pointing out that the legislature seemed to lose the difference between a fair criticism of government policy and an act of legislature. The purpose of privilege is when somebody comments on what goes on inside a house, in the conduct of the proceedings of the house, or attributes motives to the house, to the legislature. Ministers, chief ministers are all parts of the executive. They are members of government. They can always be criticized. Their criticism, if it's in the bounds of fair criticism, cannot be complained against. But in any event, their criticism, whether fair or unfair, is not an issue of the legislature for it to become a breach of privilege of legislature. So according to me, breach of privilege of legislature arises only when there is an actual commenting or an obstruction in the proceedings of the House, when there is an actual attribution of motives to the proceedings before a House, and not when there's a criticism of any governmental action or governmental authority.
Whether the media needs to regulate themselves, the central government has said maybe in digital that could possibly be done, but a self-regulatory mechanism, how can it come about when there are so many different regulatory bodies?
A self-regulatory body is when the body itself chooses amongst itself a certain committee to regulate its own activities and therefore regulate themselves. That is what is essential for a democracy. You can't have the government regulating the media, then that's the end of democracy.
I also want to ask you, there is a case pending, sir, in the Supreme Court in which a lot of talk is being done about media regulation. Now the Supreme Court bench of Justice Chandrachud, Justice Joseph and Justice Indu Malhotra has said and asked questions on whether the media needs to regulate themselves. The central government has said maybe in digital that could possibly be done, but a self-regulatory mechanism, how can it come about when there are so many different regulatory bodies? So the court, how should the court be looking at an aspect when they say that the media should be having a self-regulatory mechanism?
The self-regulatory mechanism is a complete anomaly to a regulatory body. The fact is, if it's a regulatory body, it is a statutory body set up by the state. So it is not self-regulatory, it is externally regulatory. A self-regulatory body is when the body itself chooses amongst itself a certain committee to regulate its own activities and therefore regulate themselves. That is what is essential for a democracy. You can't have the government regulating the media, then that's the end of democracy. So it has to be self-regulatory. But at the same time, I also feel that sometimes self-regulatory bodies fail. So what I really believe is that while you can have no pre-censorship, if media itself is irresponsible in some way and hurts another person's fundamental rights in a way that they should not, then the penal consequences for their actions should be very strict. Then they should be very strictly dealt with, but post facto, not interfering with their right to comment. But if they have done something wrong, they should be held responsible through the courts. And that should be very strict and brought in. But so far as regulating the media is concerned, I cannot see or justify any external regulation. It has to be an internal regulation coupled with, if any breach by the media of its responsibilities, then they can be penalized heavily for it post facto.
Yes. Mr. Sundaram, exactly the point, therefore, that's the kind of regulation that could possibly be needed. My last question, sir, to you, whether it's been the Jessica Lal case where you've spoken about it, whether it's been the Nitish Katara cases, you've always been a people's lawyer, the conscience keeper rather of society or people, trying to give out a sense about what needs to happen. In this case that's currently taken on the entire nation watching it, more than the parts like the drug angle or something in the Sushant Singh Rajput case, I ask you, when it comes to the behaviors of certain governments like the Maharashtra government, like the Mumbai police, should that not also be seen through the same spectrum that every action of the media is being done?
Look, like I said earlier, it is essential that every organ of the state acts as per its responsibilities, acts fully as per its responsibilities, acts reasonably, fairly and honestly. Unfortunately, there is a public perception that the various other institutions, like for example the police, there's a lot of doubt about the police's effectiveness, the police's honesty. It's unfortunate. There's a lot of doubt about the court's effectiveness. They feel justice delayed, etc., etc. So I think in all that, the media has got a great deal of influence today. And like I used the expression earlier, it's almost become a people's court. And therefore, being a people's court, while I agree that the executive trying to interfere incessantly with the media is abominable and should never be permitted, at the same time, the media should itself live up to the responsibility given to it and carry out its functions in that way.
Absolutely. On that note, Mr. Sundaram, I want to thank you for being our Legal Eagle this week and also shedding light on how the media's role needs to be seen here as the people's court, as you so eloquently put it. I thank you, sir, for being with us. A very important point being made by senior advocate Mr. C.A. Sundaram when he says, because the other institutions in the democracy have failed, the media has stepped in. As we leave you on that note, it's also very clear that other organs of the democracy, the legislative and the executive, also need to be watching their role. Thank you for being with us on the Legal Eagle this week. See you next week.